Under the Bed by Josiah Miles Pitchforth. Copyright 2010. All rights reserved. All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. Edgar Allan Poe. 1. With her head on his chest, he felt strong. Lying in bed together was a quiet time. It was a mysterious nature. It was the mysteries of comfort. Sometimes they would talk in mellowed tongue, lucid with their thoughts and dreams. Other times they would listen to the drifting moan of a passing car and watch as its headlights washed and soaked the dark room, flooding, then passing. The refreshing warmth of spring had yet to yawn itself into existence, and so winter remained unwanted. But with the cold came an uneasy sense of change. Dan saw it coming. "I was at the shop today," Theresa casually said, "and on the street I saw an old couple." Her voice was soothing, and so Dan would listen just to hear her talk. "Oh yeah?" he asked. His eyelids felt like softly dying butterflies. His mind was massaged by the presence of this conversation, this girl, his girl. It was good to hear her talk. Everything had been good lately. "Yeah," she said. It pleased her to calm Dan like she knew she could. To touch him on that wavelength where she found herself, lingering in these small hours of the prenatal dawn. "What did they look like?" he asked. His lips barely parted as he spoke, a ventriloquist to his lazy mind. Theresa was fluent in Dan's muttering, almost fond of it. She contemplated his half-hearted question and patiently waited as the words collected and formed in her mouth. "They looked like the last two lovers on earth." The weight of her response was heavy on his chest. It would have frightened him, but Dan felt strong. With her head on his chest, he felt strong. "Really?" replied Dan coyly. "Yeah." She toyed with the hair around his nipple, her right ear muffled by the sound of his close heart beating. "I think we should get married," she said with eyes that penetrated the dark shadows in every corner of the room. "I don't want to," said Dan. His words were short. It was as if an invisible hand reached up from his strong heart and pulled his tongue back tightly. He laid there, a brute self, quietly in his own skin, and away from Theresa. "Why not?" she asked. "Because then we're trapped." Dan's words seemed recited. He choked on the truth. "We're not kids, I know that." He conjured his words carefully, like a man on his deathbed, thinking that what he said in that moment would be remembered. "We're not kids, but it's nice to be like this." "Who says it will stop?" asked Theresa. Her voice went high and quiet. "The laws." "The laws? Of time." "Daniel," started Theresa, "growing older isn't a law. It's a choice we all must make," she said, delivering her point with a subtle, slight shift as her body adjusted to endure a longer conversation on that old mattress which had been owned for ages. "Your soul enters mine because it leaves what it must leave behind." She slid her fingertips down his chest. "Every snake must shed its skin." And with that she hissed before kissing the corner of his mouth. Her playfulness was unwanted, and she sensed this. "Anyways, I don't think things would change all that much." "That's because you don't think," said Dan. Theresa looked up at him once more. She waited for further explanation. She watched him, perched on the verge of being offended by such an intrusive remark. "You only feel what you think is right." Theresa heard this, and she sank. She sank into the heartbeat of Dan's chest. Her ear, once more, was muffled. Her body was still and slightly saddened. "Are you bored?" asked Dan. No, was the timid reply. Then why must there be a next episode? It's not another episode, it's our lives. This is our life, said Dan, staring out the window. And it's perfect. Again their eyes met, and they both smiled, though both of them were unsure whether or not it was a joke or a warm sentiment. Dan put his finger up to her face, let the knuckle rest on her rosy red cheek. You can have my finger, he said, and with that there erupted that cosmic quiver between her legs. Her response was not meant to flatter Daniel, and he seemed oblivious to it regardless. It was involuntary and something that Theresa had long since surrendered to. But you can never put a bond on it. It was not a smug cruelty that Daniel carried, but a distant lament from his long-lost upbringing. He delivered the cold cement that lay beneath everything he had said in regards to their relationship. It was how he spoke when he was really serious. This is not where your power comes from. Theresa's eyes turned glossy. She was completely disarmed when he leaned in to kiss her. She turned away. She lifted herself off of his body and feigned an interest in sleep. Lying on her own chest now, she stared blankly at the empty bottle of wine that preceded their evening moments in that old bed. She reached out to it in a thoughtless trance and casually knocked it off the bedside table. Two. Daylight came like an expected thief. The alarm went off by Theresa's side of the bed. It sounded like some sick and twisted interpretation of how a rooster might call if its soul had been trapped in some unchanging digital technology. It was the cold comfort of unnatural fixtures in the lives of 21st century creatures. Creatures like Dan and Theresa. It had to be silenced. And Theresa did so. She nudged Dan with her elbow until he eventually stirred. Time to get up, she said. What time is it? Slithered out Dan's response. That time. And there they were, two night owls trying their best not to enable one another and allow the crucial 15 minutes needed to get ready for work to slip by. Theresa worked in a flower shop, and lately had to be getting to work earlier and earlier to finish up the arrangements for a large wedding that was taking place right there in town, though she seemed unable to connect these dots to her most recent desires. Dan was a toll booth operator and was cursed with the early morning rush hour shift, which of course in rural Maine meant a steady stream of traffic for about a half hour, and then the cars would drip by like drops from a leaky faucet, each to their own direction. After that, he would watch the daytime talk shows on a small black and white TV with the dial broken, giving him the option of either Jerry Springer or nothing. He chose Jerry. He would snack on old donuts and cold coffee. The booth reeked like cigarette smoke and depression. Dan hated his job and hated everything about getting up in the morning. Resenting the days, to him, was merely a routine at this point. Fuck. He spit the words out with a sigh and slowly swung his feet out from underneath the warm sheets. He planted them on the icy hardwood floors of his dark bedroom and released a benevolent shiver. Goodbye, said Theresa, still in bed, trying to sound awake. He leaned back and kissed the top of her head, not minding her hair, the dry strands of raven black tickling his lips. Have a day, she said. Dan waddled into the bathroom and pissed with the door open. He thought about the conversation they had the night before, and he thought about marriage. Dan was 25, Theresa was 23, and he wondered if she was trying to climb some wall he didn't know about. People often say that others have a wall around themselves. He wondered that, if one did exist for him, if he was trying too hard to ignore it. But no, the answers faded. The wall, the talk, Theresa. Fuck, he said aloud to no one in particular. It was time to go to work. He stared at himself long and hard in the mirror. Every feature in his tired face waited to be seen like the stars at night. His face had changed since last time he looked at it, since last time he really tried to see it. And it was in this time, before he could blink, that something was spotted briefly out of the corner of his eye. It moved in the bedroom. Dan's brain was just waking up. He thought that maybe it was the last bit of a dream spilling out of him, like there was something left of him, something clinging from that part of himself he knew only in sleep. But something was there. Something moved fast and silent with the graceful fear of a wild animal. Dan could swear that it had arms and legs, that it was small like a dog. It might have been green. Hairs on the back of Dan's neck stood up, electrified by primal instincts. His shoulder felt tapped by the ghost of monkeys, fight or flight, all that nonsense. Dan turned and leaned halfway into the bedroom, his hands bracing himself on either side of the door jamb. His eyes darted across the room, every nook and cranny. He checked under the bed. Nothing. The morning light illuminated the room with a warm, soft glow and milked all the corner shadows completely. Theresa sensed Dan's pause. "What is it?" she muttered. "I thought I saw something," said Dan, resisting his concern successfully. "What?" "I don't know." Dan rubbed his eyes. "I must still be dreaming." Theresa smiled out of sight and continued her spongy descent into the nothingness of sleep once more. Three. It was cold that morning, and in his booth, the small heater that sat next to the cash register slowly made the air around Dan feel dry and unreal, though it did thaw him. An old black Cadillac pulled up to Dan's booth. It was a '69, and it shined like the proud owner. He was a middle-aged man with his middle-aged wife. He had thinning white hair and a jolly round face. He smiled as if he knew no other expression when he handed Dan the dollar bill. Dan took it. The old man looked down for a second before he spoke. "Excuse me," he said. "Yeah?" asked Dan. "Could you tell me how far to Castle Rock?" The question lingered there on a pleasant tone, but Dan wasn't impressed. "What do you want to go there for?" replied Dan. "That place is a pit." "Well," the man started. Dan felt the limit of their exchange to be exceeded as the man's brief explanation passed through his ears, unheard. "Head north," said Dan. "It's the third exit from Bangor." "Oh," smiled the man. "Thank you." The old man and his wife exchanged a look with one another before they sped off. In Dan's line of work, he would spend all day saying no more than a couple of sentences to passing strangers. It wasn't so much that he enjoyed these brief conversations with the excessive frequency on which they occurred, only that he felt as though this particular way of the day suited him. He wasn't interested in knowing a lot of people, though he did not despise them in general. He did not want to be alone. That left him with an empty feeling. He merely wanted to recycle his hellos, as if refueling what little personality he had left since starting this job. And then came the next one. It was a red pickup with only one man driving this time. He had a face that was familiar, big glasses with an old prescription, liver spots, and yellow teeth from chewing tobacco. His name was Oscar, and he was of the same age as Dan's father. In fact, he knew the man as he did Dan. "Danny boy," he said. "Oscar, how are you?" "Good, good," came the reply. Money was exchanged. Oscar looked behind him to see that no other traffic waited. "I've been well. Things are good." "Good," said Dan. Without his recycled hellos, he was an awkward, empty shell of a man. "You know, how's your father?" Oscar abruptly started out. "Have you been to see him lately?" "When I can. was Dan's confident reply. It was defensive, but confident. How's he doing? I don't know. And there it was, out there in the open for everyone to see, including this brash prick, Oscar. Dan knew this was what Oscar wanted to hear. Oscar needed to lecture the youth, to tell them of how infantile they were next to the greatest generation. Dan had known this about Oscar for a long time, for about as long as he knew the man. Yet all of Dan's disdain for his inquisitor could not cover up the fact that Victor Livingston was living in the VA hospital without a regular visit from his son. How lousy, Dan thought in his heart of hearts. What people didn't know, or at least failed to consider, was that Victor was somewhere around 50 when Dan was born, and never much paid attention to the boy. Victor was more interested in the mother, Dan's mother. Dan had to be the bigger man on the rare occasion that he did pay a visit to his father. You should see him, said Oscar, with his eyes fixed on a point unknown. Why? Asked Dan. It wasn't Thanksgiving. It wasn't Christmas. It wasn't the old man's birthday, and as far as Dan knew, there was no medical emergency. Oscar looked insulted. Because he's your father. Through the grimace of a smirk, the kind of smirk that happens when someone doesn't know what the fuck you're talking about, or how you could be so ignorant, he glared. All right, said Dan. He handed the old man victory as easily as he handed him the change for his $5. It was here that Dan saw Oscar defeated without a fight to fight. Not knowing what else to say, Oscar drove off. It was his father who had gotten him the job several years ago. Dan's father worked the Scarborough exit for many years. I-95 south and north supported Dan Livingston's family. It was not just the lifeblood for the state of Maine and New England, or even the eastern coast of the United States for that matter. Another hour and a half until his next smoke break. Shit. Dan thought about the passing of time. "4. To examine the blossom of a flower was to witness nature's glory. The idea that something could sprout from something so cold and distant like a stem or a bud and become something so beautiful was a concept, Theresa thought, and it adhered to her. That is to say, it pleased her to think like this, like owning a secret, taking possession of it and not sharing it with anyone else. She imagined lots of people did this, like all the flowers of a field, thinking they are drastically different. Flowers were beautiful, and no one would dare say this openly. No one would betray themselves in such a way. Sure, there would be the Hallmark cards and the roses are red, violets are blue kind of poetry, but that was just a superficial blanket to keep the real truth inside. Something to be taken for granted. No one would ever be open about it. No one would ever really talk of nature's glory. Beyond science, beyond poetry, beyond all that which is accepted, it was the petals of a flower that paved the infinite road into our unknown beauty. She stood there, leaning up against the glass counter, her cute little hips and her cute little body, watching. That's what she loved the most, watching. Her arms were folded in an asymmetrical fashion. One hand braced her chin, the other braced the glass counter. She watched, imagining the flower to blossom, before it ever could. It only took a moment for Theresa to realize that she was in the most comfortable place she could imagine, in the most comfortable place she could imagine, and in the most comfortable position she could imagine. She watched. Her boss, Sandra, was self-conscious about the fact that Theresa's workload had lightened to a considerable degree now that they scratched the early hours of afternoon. Self-conscious is what Sandra usually felt in regards to her business, despite any amount of success she may or may not have been having. She had bought the house in downtown Saco years ago. It was a historic property that was built and owned by a wealthy sea captain in the earlier part of the 19th century, who later led a failed campaign for governorship. It was Sandra's son, a local construction worker, who renovated the home into a storefront. Sandra, in her angst, decided that she was going to try and find ways to keep Theresa busy, but beneath it all was a brewing resentment for the fact that passerbyers on that afternoon did not apparently have a need for flowers. She crossed behind her young employee. "Theresa?" Theresa lifted her eyes to meet Sandra. "Why don't you help me stem those roses in the back?" she said, pointing to the back room where she herself had no intention of going. "Sure," said Theresa, remaining her usual chirpy self despite the implicit tone of her superior. She turned on her heels and headed for the back room. The room was dark and cool and quiet. Theresa picked up the big clippers and stared at a dozen roses that lay on the workbench. She thought about Dan, and she began to snip off the thorns of a rose. That selfish prick. He wasn't selfish in the usual way. He didn't necessarily want things all and only for himself. He didn't always just think of himself. In fact, often he would open doors for her and do all the gentlemanly things to do, but he was selfish in the sense that he thought he was always right, that he had nothing to learn from Theresa, and she let it happen. She had let her man think he was the brains in the relationship. There was a cold, dark fear that palmed the back of her mind for a brief moment, and then left, so this fear became a stoic concern. She thought that if Dan was the brains, he might not ever want to get married. She resented him for making her so self-conscious, and she was just as smart and just as capable of thinking and talking as Dan was. She wondered how it got to that point, where Dan was the end-all and say-all of all matters regarding their relationship. She had the love. She gave it to him. She should have had a lot more say in these matters. They had been together for 3 years now, and Dan still refused to even entertain the notion of marriage. This wasn't right. She decided that she was going to fuck him that evening and then bring it up again like a dagger. It would be an ultimatum. She did love him, and it would be difficult to leave, and she wondered if this dagger would be a fair one. Fair or not, she had to make her move. Her life, her love, wanted to be a whirlwind. It wanted to be a whirlwind, and it wanted to be settled, one way or the other. To leave him would be to leave his umbrella, to run naked through the chaos of all that had gone unsaid in their wet, tumultuous love, all of the ignored ups and downs, all the entanglements she felt. One way or another, somebody was going to have to blossom, he for her, or she for the freedom of the unknown. The unknown, that little green monster she would soon see out of the corner of her eye. It would start from the cobwebbed corner of that back room with the sound of a rustling disturbance. Some clay pots would rattle and tumble. She turned quickly to see nothing, and then for a second, something small like a dog. It had 4 legs, or it walked on all 4s. It could have been green. But it was gone before she could blink. Her body, beneath her skin, was illuminated by cold chills as she felt herself pee a little. She wanted something horrible to happen in that moment, for dark shadows to come crushing down upon her, for at least then her fear could be warranted and her sanity intact. But no, there was nothing. Nothing more. 5. The sun was shining that afternoon like the permanent gloss of a forgotten day. It was quiet and uneventful. Dan pulled into the hospital parking lot and found a space the way a slug finds a home. Nobody was outside, and the building stood tall and strong, about 3 or 4 floors of brick and mortar. There was a large statue of the Virgin Mary out front, with her arms wide open, welcoming the poor and sick as if they were all her children. Dan studied it a moment. Somebody, somewhere, decided long ago that it would be her refuge offered beyond those doors. He couldn't tell if the expression on her face looked sad or sleepy. It occurred to him as he distanced himself from the car that he had not brought anything. It was just himself, and he felt oddly naked without a card or a gift or something. A brisk breeze caused him to shrug and left him with his shoulders up. Since he already assumed the position, he dared to think the statement, "Who cares?" The hospital resided in a small valley surrounded by forest. It was hollowed ground, and Dan's footsteps across the parking lot pavement made light-hearted echoes. He entered through the sliding glass doors, which hardly worked. They started a moment, as if to test the hesitant, for within these walls were the dying, not for the faint of heart, and then finally subsided. Dan was greeted by the receptionist at the front desk. She looked to be a student from some local community college. She was a young black woman, and when Dan saw her, he immediately began to fantasize about her. She looked up at him from that desk with those doe eyes, and Dan felt in his chest the heart of a hunter. Her skin was perfect. She had the kind of soft skin that men often desired touching, if only with their normal hands. It was light and brown, like the satin hide of something so smooth and exotic, a sexual creature. Dan pictured himself with her in the broom closet, her bent over, and she would look up at him with those same doe eyes. "I know you," she said, as he approached the desk. Dan was taken aback. "It's been a while," said Dan, almost under his breath, ashamed. "No, I don't think it's from here. I just started working here." Her emphasis on the word "here" struck Dan as odd and almost intriguing. Maybe it was just her doe eyes. "But I know you. Where have I seen you before?" Dan just wanted to leave at that moment. If he could, he would. His mind was distracted. If he could run right back outside and never have to see his father again, he would. The young receptionist sensed Dan's lack of interest. "Are you here to see—" "Victor Livingston," said Dan, sparing her from what she thought she ought to know. "Yes," she smiled politely. "Is he breathing all right?" asked Dan. The young receptionist scooted her chair back and began to flip through some files until she came across an answer. She retrieved what she was looking for quickly. "Yes," she said. "He's alive and waiting." She almost instantly regretted mentioning the fact that Victor was alive. If there was to be no mention of death in these halls, one must never bring up life. At least not to someone like Dan. "Waiting," said Dan, half-humored by the thought. How often had he waited for his father in one way or another? "Alive," he said. "That's good." "Yes," she smiled warmly, trying to compensate. She pointed in the direction down the hall to which Dan already knew. It was coming back to him now. Little dust mites were free in the window's glow of the late-day sun. Free to fall, free to float, free to die. They took light as Dan spotted them and gave it a different direction. Dan hated this part. Entering the room for the first time, he rapped knuckles against the door jamb, but it did no good. Victor sat quietly in his chair by the bed. His back to Dan. Dan watched the old man for a bit, not saying anything. He hid inside his own skin, waiting to be greeted, waiting to be alive in his father's eyes. But that wasn't going to happen, not unless he stoked the moment. He slid onto the counter to rest his legs. He looked around the room. It was a house inside a room. All of the pictures in picture frames, the old Afghans, the mementos. It was Custer's last stand of Victor's life in this 10 by 10 room. It was a terminal for Victor's dementia to eventually rise up out of its last stages and fade into the sky with the spirit of a dead father. But today, Victor was alive. And waiting. "Fuck," said Dan aloud and to himself. The old man turned to him. It was Dan's father, sure enough. "What are you doing here?" barked Victor. His voice rattled from the back of his throat and sounded like an engine, a body in need of repair. "Am I sick?" he asked. "Yes," said Dan. "I mean, sicker than usual," clarified Victor. "No," said Dan, quietly. "Then what are you doing here?" Dan shrugged. There was no breeze this time, but he shrugged all the same. He looked around the room as if he might find something to talk about. There was nothing but the past. "I saw Oscar Thompson today." "Who?" There was always the cranky clasp in that question. Victor would often forget people and then resent the fact that he needed to ask for reminding. "Oscar Thompson is a man who remembers you," said Dan. "Yes, of course," said Victor. "He plays darts down at the club." Yes, he does. Dan, in fact, had no idea if this was true or not, but it sounded true, and that was good enough. "How's your girl?" asked Victor. "Who?" replied Dan, still surprised that the old man was remembering. "You know who," snapped back Victor. "Don't fuck with me." Dan had to laugh a little. "Theresa," he said. "Yeah, sure, her. She's all right. She's good." Dan thought about the conversation he had with her the previous night. "She's fine, I guess." "You guess," said Victor. He still hadn't really looked at his son yet. He seemed to be more focused on the atmosphere of the room. Dan was a little stunned that the old man was already this belligerent so early in the conversation. Secretly, this was a blessing because it gave Dan a reason to leave just a little bit sooner. "If she's going to be living in my house," started Victor. "If you and she are going to be living in my house, then there better not be any guessing between the two of you." Dan and Theresa moved into the house after Victor began his stay at the home. But Dan still didn't know what Victor meant, his vigilance against guessing. He could have just as easily dropped it and moved on, but there was just enough spite in his heart to refuse the opportunity to challenge the old man. What he did not know, though, what he could never know, was his father's frustration of dealing with the slow end, where guesses were like sharp stones that were hurled in a mocking manner. "I don't know what you mean, Dad." "What? What's wrong with guessing?" "What?" Victor turned now and gave his son a once-over, head to toe. He scoffed. "You're living in sin." This again made Dan laugh a little. His father ignored it. "Are you going to marry her?" said Victor. "Get off that counter." Dan got off the counter and went and sat in front of his father. "No, I'm not," he said. Victor casually dusted off his bedside table with his hand. "Look at this," said Victor, as he showed his son a dusty fingertip. "Dust everywhere. You don't want to live like this." "I don't think I'm going to." "I didn't think that way either. I lived as young as I could, always." "I know you did, Dad," said Dan. "Why don't you marry her?" "Because I'm not like you." "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're a hypocrite," said Dan. "Living in sin," he continued under his breath. Victor studied his son before he spoke. "I lose track of what I say sometimes," he finally said. "But I think I know where that comes from." Victor looked away. "Living in sin?" asked Dan. "Yeah, it's biblical," said Victor. "I know that." Dan could not hide his incensed reaction. No, ever since Adam and Eve got kicked out of it, we've all been living in sin. Or something like that. Victor seemed tired. He seemed so very tired and fading. The room might have been spinning for him at that moment, Dan couldn't tell. Looking at him, in that moment, Dan deduced that his father might have been hollowed by all of the old man's experiences. It was as if each day had been chipped out of him, and that now he sat, a shell of a man, with nothing but his eyes to watch the dust mites flutter and flow. Sunlight came through the window like a tilted pillar, glowing, keeping the whole room on a tethered life support. "I don't have all the answers," said Victor, as if he was reading the young man's thoughts. "It's elusive. Only my regret is real." "Elusive?" asked Dan. Victor's cryptic lecture had laid a plank down across the space between them and invited Dan to storm across, angry and on fire, armed to the teeth and ready to cut the heart out of his old man for reasons he himself could not remember. It was an ancient resentment, almost primal. Dan found himself clinging to these notions of a genetic memory as desperately as one might hang from the edge of a cliff. He thought of that something green and small that had whisked itself by the corner of his sight earlier in the morning. "Yeah, that's what I said, elusive." Victor was not as vulnerable as Dan had thought. He was really trying to say something. The pupils of his father's eyes were dilated from whatever medication the old man was on, and it made them look black and demonic. Dan trembled at the thought of how his father might see him. Was it in an insane clarity, something almost prophetic, or was it a blur? A blur beneath the surface of dreams, torturing the drowning mind. So close, one would never see. "There are things I've kept from you," said Victor to his son. "Elusive things," Dan confirmed sarcastically. "Yes, that's right. Elusive things." Victor's words began to dribble. "The things I've kept from you, your mother, God rest her soul." Dan thought about the house he and Theresa had inherited from his parents. Only he thought about it in its earlier existence, when his mother and father used to live in it. They kept that house quiet and still, with stale love that lingered like the smell of a home-cooked meal. Dan had always felt that when he visited, either with or without Theresa, he was visiting the lives of the uninterrupted. They were like ghosts in their own home. "There are some things secret, and there are some things hidden in love," added Victor. He clapped his hands once. It was a loud snap that startled Dan, and then Victor watched the dust mites float. "I never loved you," Victor said deliberately. "Not like your mother. I loved her once." "You never loved me," said Dan calmly. It, oddly enough, didn't bother him as much as he might have thought it would. "Not like your mother," clarified Victor. Dan continued to listen, not at all clarified. He looked to the open door, hoping that some nurse in the hallway would hear this and be able to testify to something or someone who could judge. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "I don't know," said Victor, his black eyes remaining completely opened. "Just listen," he continued. Dan knew the old man was drifting. Even if he wanted to, he could not allow himself to be hurt by the frankness. Only deeply, somewhere within, a little saddened. This was his future, and at 25, Dan had already felt like an old man. "I'm listening," said Dan, solemn. "I live my life only as a man, all my life. Never anything mystic, not like the others." Before Dan could inquire about these remarks, Victor continued. It's some kind of curse. Some kind of curse of vacancy. Vacancy. Victor looked around the room before returning to his son. A father is a man who has taken something from the mother of his child, something intangible. Victor looked down. I never took from her. Dan closed his eyes and opted not to speak. Perhaps they passed the topic of Victor's numerous infidelities and beyond the topic of his mother's broken heart. But again, what did Dan know about it? Very little, he concluded. I'm listening, he said. But there are things in love I've discovered. Your wife, do you love her? Dan opened his eyes to speak. I'm not married, he said. What? I'm not married. Who are you? Asked Victor. He seemed genuinely confused. Dan couldn't help but laugh, and so he did. He laughed in the face of his senile father, but the laughing had to stop, and it did with Dan's blood running cold. I don't see the point of it, Dan finally said, reserved now. The old man scoffed. Of course you don't. Dad, what are you trying to say? Asked Dan. Why are you talking like this? What are these strange things in love you speak of? Dan let the aggressive inquisition seep through his voice, like the uncontrollable ooze of a bleeding corpse. The questions needed to be asked, whether answered or not. Dan's frustration could no longer be tamed by whatever social sensibilities he was supposed to have in that situation. He was not a civilized man. He never could be. He was a dead man bleeding. It's toxic, said Victor, and I'll die without ever learning why. Toxic, asked Dan. He now only looked for the time to leave. It didn't feel right just yet, but it was soon coming. His ankle had been clamped, and he would soon gnaw it off. Yes, answered Victor, tragic and foolish, but there are things there, things so fragile and so dangerous. Their name protects them. They are protected by the name, a name so fragile and dangerous. Love. The old man stared off into space for a moment. Eden, he finally said. Dan wondered whether it was space or whether the old man saw something he could not without those medicated pupils. I would drink cyanide right now if they'll let me. Don't talk like that, said Dan to his father, off the cuff. Off the cuff and wanting to leave. He pondered once more what Victor was trying to tell him, like a child tempted by the Rubik's Cube. There's something hidden, said Dan, leaning in now with his arms crossed. What? In love. Yes, it's a way. I've been there, said Victor. I've been there, and I've come back, and always I'm fearful. Been where, Dad? Asked Dan. Eden, replied the old man. You mean like the Garden of Eden? Dan was humoring the old man now. I was a hero once, said Victor. Many, many years ago. He paused and studied his son. He wondered with cynicism how much he should tell Dan. The year you were born. You were a hero once, Dan repeated, hoping his father would either elaborate or go back to sleep and allow Dan the opportunity to hightail it out of there. Yes, said Victor, and I paid the price. I paid the price of things never being the same again. Victor reached out for his son, but his depth perception was off, and so his outstretched hand waved in front of Dan like an unsteady boom. Eden is real, said Victor, and it will destroy your mortal love, and you will finally know the curse of being human. Finally? Asked Dan. I've said too much. Victor seemed to be down on himself at that moment. "I've never known you to be religious, Dad." "I'm not," insisted Victor. "Religion has got nothing to do with this. Religions have got it all wrong. They don't know." "They don't know what?" "There's the war. There's a war going on." "What?" Victor moaned. "I've said too much," he added. "Yes, it's dark. Something dark just below the surface. It slithers." "Then that must not be love you're speaking of. Only that you can't see it." It became clear to Dan now that Victor wasn't always hearing him. "It's dark because you can't see it. It's there, and if you can't see it, well, that's where the trouble comes in. It will pounce." Dan checked his watch. It was getting late. "What is it?" he asked, trying not to yawn. He should have talked himself out of coming that afternoon. "It's a monster," said Victor. "A monster?" "Yes." "So it's bad?" asked Dan, feigning interest now. "I don't remember," snapped Victor. Dan sensed an ounce of fear in the old man. It was almost as if Victor thought someone or something was listening to their conversation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he shouted. "You trail my thoughts like some kind of lizard." Dan was getting seasick from this roller coaster ride of insanity. "A dragon!" shouted Victor. "I'm only trying to understand you, Dad," said Dan, barely containing his responding rage. "You're sick." Dan motioned with his hands. "Fire breathing." Dan hoped he was speaking in terms Victor could understand. "Sicker than usual?" asked his father casually. It was as if he just wiped the slate clean again. "No, not sicker than usual." "Well, there you go," said Victor. "Just listen." And the old man said nothing after that. Just silence in the room. Dan had it. He had taken as much as he could. He stood. "I'm leaving." He waited for a second, for his old man to turn young again, to make sense again, however miserable. "Where are you going?" asked Victor. "Home." "I am home," said Victor. "I have nowhere else to go." Victor felt his own son's indignation and gave it back to the boy with unreasonable disdain. This was how he defied his illness. Dan started for the door. "I have nowhere else to go but down, down into the ground." Dan turned and looked at his father once more. He closed the door behind him quietly. "6. The sunny air and breeze washed his relief. Dan stood in the parking lot a moment and breathed in air without dust mites. He heard a clink and rattling. He looked to his right to see an old black man by the bike rack. The man struggled. His fingers and body were knotted with age, and he had deep, tired eyes. He was struggling with a red 10-speed. "How do you ride this thing?" he he asked. No one in particular. The heavens, maybe. I don't remember how to ride these things. The man was on the verge of tears when he looked back and saw Dan spying him. Dan instantly recognized a jailbreak scheme when he saw one. Here, he said. He walked over to the man and helped him retrieve the unlocked bike from the rack. He held it on the sidewalk now. Get on, he said. The old man hesitantly did so. What's your name? Asked Dan. Buster, said the man. My name's Jesus H. Christ, but people call me Buster. Dan smiled. He waited a second with his hands on the back of the bicycle seat. Shit, said Buster, amazed that his plan was actually coming to fruition. He said it the way only a man who has experienced life can say it. Shit. Dan walked with Buster and the bike until the wheels were rolling in such a way that they could roll themselves. That natural balance, that natural equilibrium. A wobble, then another wobble, and then the old man was off and coasting, down the sidewalk. He laughed down the way to the point of no return, that point beyond the horizon. It was a sunny day, and he was free. Free to fuck the damsel in distress. Free to fuck the lonely housewife. Free to fuck the man that had kept him down for so long. Free to fuck life and anyone who had kept him in his past. He was free. Just another dust mite out of that old dingy motel they call the hospital. He laughed once more and waved goodbye. Dan waved back and scratched an itch on his chin. Was it a good deed or an act of anarchy? Dan didn't really care anymore. There was life on its way, and life was uncontrollable. The receptionist struggled briefly to get past the sliding doors before she frantically joined Dan by his side. Buster was out of sight by now. Did you see him? She asked. Yeah, I saw him, replied Dan coyly. Which way did he go? Dan pointed. He went that way. Are you sure? Would I lie to you? Smiled Dan. She started back to the hospital, clearly intent on phoning the authorities. Dan stopped her. He held her arm gently. How is it that you think we know each other? Asked Dan. The receptionist looked around cautiously. She put her hand on Dan's cheek and leaned in and kissed him on the lips. It was a soft kiss. Her lips were electric. Does that ring any bells? She said quietly. It does, but I still don't know where it is you think we've met. She just looked at him and hurried herself back inside. As Dan headed back to his car, he thought of his father in the room, like some buried pharaoh waiting to be discovered by archaeologists, Indiana Jones and the like. He insisted on these cold thoughts. They stressed his brain and body, but kept him inside. The room. He looked up to it at the third floor of that old brick building. There it was, and there it will always be. He studied it, and though it was compelling on the inside, it was better to be seen as just a window, one among many. Right in its place on earth, as it had to be. His father, with black vacant eyes, was the flesh and blood of a history he might never know, a history of secrets and things unknown, a history of something that loved his mother. What was that love, and did he ever see it? Dan tried to remember. The moments of his youth were scrolled and filed as they were searched. Attempts were made to highlight any subtext, any glance he might have seen or any touch he might have witnessed in the kitchen or living room. They were there, he just never saw it. They were there. They were dark. Better left for the archaeologists. 7. The flowers blossomed. They were the outstretched fingers of an instinctual desire. That desire could be seen many ways, for it was crystallized. Theresa saw it one way. She loved Dan, and Dan loved her. She saw the straight path every time she glanced at an orchid, no matter the angle. And of course, it seduced. It offered her a creative amount of chaos to her stability, the alternative, anything but love. They were there, and they were wild, but she was there, and she saw love. She saw Dan. In her heart, and in the nest inside her stomach that fueled any heat, any erotic intentions, she brewed like some warm biblical flood that would invoke upon a word or sensation. The presence of the moment swiftly slit a window in her mind. Memories of the past flooded her, bright-colored memories of blue skies and plush grass. The sensation left her drifting. She thought of those 3 years in high school when her passion was a private pet, owned by Peter. Peter Lee Smith was his name, but everybody called him Petey, a nickname he detested with every internal fiber he possessed, but defeated, he would respond. He was morbid, and he reminded the popular girls of some kind of gorilla. He wasn't fat, only that he had long shaggy hair that, depending on the air of any given day, appeared to form and unform its way in and out of dreadlocks. Theresa was a goth. It was around the time that her breasts began to grow that she started wearing all black. The other girls would be secretly frightened of her. Truly uncertain they were as to just how easy it would be for themselves to slip into that pale depression, that seduction. Only a nihilist like Theresa could find the abundant shelter that indifference had to offer and stay safe from the wild freedom that broke young girls' hearts. But then came Petey, that manic gorilla with deep penetrating eyes who spoke only when spoken to. Theresa followed his notes from study hall into the graveyard where she and Petey liked to meet. It was a local cemetery in the womb of a tall, dark forest. He introduced her to his secret life of thoughts and feelings, and she wanted to be his audience, to please him. To do so lifted her mind. He had taught her the practice of chalking different gravestones. It was something that they began to do quite frequently, and she looked forward to it, telling no one. The romance was erotic. The graves would be a body, her body, any body, and the paper and charcoal would be traced methodically. Theresa never talked to Petey about the mother he lost at a very early age. Sometimes it would loom between the two of them in their moments together, but he would disperse of it. Together, on that plush green grass, beneath the gorgeous blue skies, in their graveyard, he would shift his eyes or swat at a passing insect. There was one grave in particular that the two of them loved to visit. Theresa's memory found itself buried there. It was of a man who died in 1978, and on his gravestone he had engraved, or at least the arrangements were made, "Here lies the loneliest man on earth." Right there in Buxton, Maine, was the final resting place for the loneliest man on earth. Petey said that the guy once appeared on The Tonight Show back in the day, but he couldn't for the life of him remember why. Petey and Theresa would lie by the grave and laugh and laugh and laugh until they cried. It was both the funniest and the saddest thing they had ever seen. They would smoke a joint and gleefully revel in their own way of dressing and thinking, grateful that they had finally found their own little Mecca, that they had found each other. It would take months before Theresa would ever get over Petey for breaking up with her and going out with Cindy Thompson, that bitch with the big tits. Theresa never told Petey that she had secretly chalked the engraving of the loneliest man. She kept the thinly thick tracing paper with the engraving and laminated it. It was snug beneath her mattress and box spring in college. She had kept it all those years, long after the memories of Petey and their awkward sex faded from her hard thoughts to the ether. And yet now she no longer had it. Without paying much attention, she had lost it forever during one of her many moves after school. She thought of that engraving now, and trailing on the heels of that were dark thoughts, a shadow. They chilled her and narrowed her eyes. She thought of something in that coffin. She could see this in her mind. It was not the loneliest man, no. It was something inhuman, small like a dog. It was probably green. It clawed in the coffin, slowly trying to get out, and made little rabid noises. Theresa's heart skipped a beat. She became afraid of tomorrow. The bell rang. That meant someone had entered the store. Startled, Theresa awoke from her distant gaze. She was still in the back room now. She could hear Sandra greet the young man. "I want to buy some flowers," said the young man. He spoke like he was young, like he was of that age, foolish enough to believe that anyone would take his lackadaisical tone seriously. He probably resented the fact that he was so transparent to the older woman, older like his mother. He was obligated to be absent, and yet that annoying heart of his beat so strongly in his chest that it made his voice flutter. Theresa popped her head out, and she spied on the boy. He couldn't have been older than 16. "Do you have anything in mind?" asked Sandra, pretending not to know the answer to her question. "No," he stammered. He stammered his words out like the shy and resentful little puke that he was. "But it's our first date." He and the store were one. He hated the store, so he hated himself. "It's for the dance," he continued as if he needed clarification. The spring ball was coming up, and everybody knew it, especially Sandra in the shop. Sandra teased the young man, hoping to coax him into ease with his own disposition. She smiled flirtatiously. "Well," she said, "different flowers mean different things, depending on the occasion." "Do you have flowers?" asked the young man, stuck on that word. He knew only flowers, nothing specific. He thought to clarify. "We've known each other for a while," he added, clearing his throat on the words, as if honesty was like a hiccup or a cough or the coming of some unwanted common cold. "I want to buy her some flowers now," he said. "What do you have when—" The young man hoped that Sandra could finish his sentence for him. His voice trailed off like love from the fingertips of an outstretched hand. Sandra studied the boy carefully. She saw his head sink down with his voice, and she saw his eyes shut off. Was he cold or just plain weak? Was he shy like a boy trapped in the body of someone older than he ought to be? Was he alive inside or only pretending? Her aged awareness carefully read these fluent attributes. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," she finally said. She waited for the young man to finish his sentence, as if it contained something she might have forgotten. Theresa watched the young man's face. She saw the anxiety of his own personal quest to conquer the territory of virginity. It was almost a cliché. It was written on his face. She left the back room completely and sanctioned a spot at the corner of the counter. She leaned up against that counter as if she owned it, like a throne or a lover. That was her rock, and she was the siren. "I can show him," she offered to Sandra. Sandra, self-conscious and still not knowing what the boy wanted, or at least how to say what the boy wanted, stepped aside. She did so in a way that wouldn't be noticed. The young man looked up at Theresa, his naked eyes enticed by the sudden presence of someone he didn't have to talk to, someone who understood him completely. "I think I have some paperwork to do upstairs," added Sandra. She touched Theresa's shoulder as she brushed by her and headed up the old flight of stairs. There were few things original in that shop, few pieces of the architecture that had remained unrestored, and the staircase was one of them. It creaked like an animal as Sandra hiked the flight slowly. Theresa studied the boy once more. Without her fully realizing it, the moment became languid and sensual. "Why don't I show you a few things in the back?" she heard herself say. She felt as a guide waiting for the student to find the next step on that dark and dusty path, which was illuminated Only by a presence not yet experienced. She thought of Petey. "Okay," said the young man, as he followed her behind the counter and into the cool, dark room where fauna of all types were kept in old soda coolers which Sandra had bought from a bankrupt convenience store. Theresa turned around and faced the boy. "It's your first date?" she asked. "Yeah," said the boy. "With her?" The boy looked at Theresa, and her gaze lured every ounce of unwanted honesty right out of him. It was an odd, almost magical occurrence. He had at least sensed this to some degree before, from either his mother or some other women who were comfortable with him. It was like a card that could be played to turn the tables. It was a disruption in time, and a disruption in the consistency of the young man's perspective. "Ever," said the boy. Theresa nodded her head. "Oh," she said, already knowing the answer even before the boy spoke. His eyes told her everything. The boy reminded her of Dylan Sloan, her first real boyfriend in the 8th grade. She recalled the unrequited passion of their first kiss and how Dylan had shed his awkward youthful shell and breathed light into her fresh virgin being for the first time. The thought turned her on in a peculiar way as she now dealt with this young stranger. The young man shivered in slight chills as he waited to talk. Theresa now found herself faced with an impulse, which flooded from her innards and wanted so desperately to take control of her hands. She hesitated as much as she could, but seeing the young man there, his eyes wide open, paved a vast plain for her actions to unfold. She gripped the edges of her shirt and slowly lifted them up above her breasts. The waistband of her tight white halter top tickled her skin and sprung her perky nipples. It was chilly in that room, and Theresa had not worn a bra that day. The young man stood dumbfounded. "What do you think of these?" Theresa asked with an intelligent sense of humor. Intelligent to the young man before her because still he stood dumbfounded. Not sure of her offering, not sure of her motives, not sure of her lesson, he just stood there, dumbfounded. He reached out. The electric touch of his virgin fingertips graced the soft and ample brawn of Theresa's tits with the slight presence of a meeting between two worlds. "Do you know what flower you want?" asked Theresa, with her eyes closed. Softly she spoke, her words floating above her like the lingering breath of an intoxicated angel. "Yes," said the man, finally. He gripped her nipples between the knuckles of his trembling fingers. He was there, but just barely there. He then retracted his touch like the quiet swarm of a trance descending. He let his hands find themselves back in the pockets of the old blue jeans he wore, jeans that were faded blue. His hands now, warm and burrowed, were doing their best to quell his growing erection. It was what they called pocket pool back at Buxton Choir Memorial Middle School, but at this moment it was nothing more than the reluctant acknowledgement of being owned for a moment. Theresa let her shirt back down. She wanted a virgin to touch her breast before she gave the ultimatum to Dan. She often thought and operated in the fashion of makeshift superstition. She found it made life just a little bit more interesting. And though her actions were selfish, she concluded no harm to be done. The young man was alive and well and ready to go. "Be good to her," she finally said. He said that he would, as he bought some lilacs and left the store without ever looking back. Dan was at the red light. He sat in his car and strained forward to keep an eye on it. 3 months ago, he had purchased an air freshener that was labeled with the title, "New Car Smell." The joke was that although he drove an '89 Volvo station wagon, which was archaically brown, he could have at least have a new car. Minus, of course, the mechanics. This would only cost him $1.29. And it was brand new, at least to one of his 5 senses. It smelt like mint and leather, especially when, as Dan often would, he gripped the air freshener which dangled from his rearview mirror and stretched it down to let it go. The red light turned green, and in turn, Dan let the engine take his car for a ride. He drove underneath the green pass of light. The day had been long, and Dan thought of several things he wanted to regret, but he couldn't. His thoughts could not grip that word to pull it and stretch it down and release it. He quickly retrieved a cigarette and lit it while driving. It was a routine of fumbling and searching through all his pockets and the dashboard, and then finding a lighter while shifting focus back to the road. Fuck, he thought. It was like getting up in the morning. It was like driving home tired. It was like paying a visit to his father. Dan didn't want to go home. He needed to avoid the inevitable intimacy that came with another moment with Theresa. The two of them, they lived under a blanket. Often they would exist under the still silk of silence, lying in bed together. She could turn and look at him, and sometimes disarm him completely. His spirits were low, and he longed so desperately to escape the power of her love. He thought of what his father had said. There are some things secret and some things hidden in love. Dan felt a strong twitch in his neck. The light had turned green. It was definitely green. It was small like a dog. He wanted to gasp for fresh air and forget all of his thoughts. He wanted to live plainly. He wanted to run wild with booze and loose women who loved to run wild with booze and hungry men. He wanted their bodies to be instruments, to tune or to play or to cast aside. He wanted angry freedom to save himself from the complicated steps of falling asleep with Theresa that night. He reached for his cell phone. It was not unlike reaching for a cigarette as he drove. Frantic, then calm, he dialed the number. The room belonged to Jeremy. The room, the apartment, everything belonged to him. It was an existence that waited to be interrupted. It was a life of interruptions. There was nothing beyond or below those interruptions. They merely existed as a life. The phone rang like some exotic bird in the jungle of an obvious burden. Jeremy answered it. He was raised by it. On the television, it was another infamous UFC fight. Hello? On the telephone, it was something new. The empty shells of several beer cans littered the couch and floor. Jeremy had downed 9 beers before the headliners. Shit, yeah, I'm up for something. To know this was to know Jeremy. I'm down for anything. To know this was to know Jeremy. Fuck yeah, I could see some titties right about now. I can't remember the last time we went out. Why are you calling me? Because I don't want to go home, replied Dan. That good? Is Theresa being a bitch? No. Dan's voice was solemn. Well, no, I just don't want to go home. I hear you, said Jeremy, even though he didn't. He paused the conversation for a moment to adjust his ballsack. I'll take you out. Twist my arm. Let's go see some titties. It was a wild, childlike proclamation, just what Dan needed to hear. Jeremy hung up the cordless phone and tossed it aside. It landed on an empty pizza box, which remained hidden beside the couch. On the way over to Jeremy's apartment, Dan thought about the roads he told. They were dark in the morning and still in the daytime like fresh, unknown paintings or haunted postcards. There would be the forest around the highway that was beautiful. He thought about the vacant stare in his father's black eyes, and how they were like a torch lit that blindly guided you through the dark caverns of a man's mind, only seeing a few steps ahead and never enough to determine a true direction. Love is like a monster. What the fuck was he saying? Dan felt inexplicably entangled in his father's own madness, and the sensation left him with nothing more than a strong desire to drink beer, then a few more, see some naked women, hang out with his old friend, and get stone drunk. A release to be revered is what he needed. Dan waited in his car outside of Jeremy's apartment. The neighborhood was rough. He counted the spots on the side of the building where the old white paint was peeling. The brick sidewalks were uneven, and the occasional passerby would be a man down on his luck. Jeremy sprung from the front door with a hurried jaunt as he finished putting his coat on. He wore an old faded Star Wars t-shirt. It was something he thought made him look cool or ironic. Dan hated it. Jeremy entered the passenger seat with a shit-eating grin and slammed the door behind him. The next doors to slam were slammed open. A pool of frat brothers spilled out into the parking lot. Their drunken banter was disjointed and chaotic like a disturbed gaggle of obnoxious geese. Dan and Jeremy stood aside and let the chaos pass them by. "This place is hopping tonight," said Jeremy. Given the anticipated tone, Dan would not have been surprised to turn and see Jeremy, his old friend, licking his lips. The bouncer eyed them suspiciously as he examined their IDs. He sensed trouble but spoke nothing of it. He let them through, and they were there. They were instantly there. It was another world, a dark world, erotic and overwhelming. "Death by blowjob," shouted Jeremy over the pulsing music, though Dan would be the only one to hear him. It was something Jeremy said when he was really happy or excited. The next 40 minutes would slip by like melting ice between the lightning strikes of a strobe light and the one long song with many chapters. 1 beer, 2 beers, 3 beers more. Dan was drunk and Jeremy was hilarious. Each wise-ass remark stacked the laughter upon the previous until it was a leaning tower of certainty and charade. Dan was running away, but he didn't care. Theresa was asleep. He tried not to care. Jeremy was an expert in navigating the nights through carelessness, and for that he was a much-needed friend. He was the kind of guy that upon meeting him, you would quickly learn his sense of humor, and not too soon after that learn to appreciate it. It was crude and unapologetic, free like a brush fire. The tower of conversation quickly began to crumble once Dan was caught by the radiating eyes of a dark Latin dancer. She strolled off the stage, knowing that her song was ending, and headed directly for Dan's table. She put her heel on the chair between Dan's leg and leaned in to speak to him. It was all too apparent that she was a seductive surgeon, methodical. Dan kept his eyes out of the young woman's endless cleavage to let her know that he was stronger than that. It seemed to garner him no more respect as she continued to exercise her presence over him. And with the words she spoke, which poured from her ruby lips like liquid leather, she let her hand find Dan's fleshy thigh. Every thread of his denim jeans felt touched by her fingertips. For it seemed that this nameless dancer had a divine kind of corruption. "I know why you're here," she said slowly. She spoke as if she really did know, and it made Dan shudder inside. The words drifted in Dan's head like her perfume. "Yes," he said. The words were stolen from him. The dancer gestured him up and led him away through the crowded bar. They entered into the back where the private booths were. One of them was empty like a church confessional on the day of a murder. They stopped by it, and she sat him down. "You're cute," she said. It was almost formal. "I know," replied Dan, and she smiled. She held his shoulders up against the wall, and then she turned around, away from him. This was the play that was played out. It was a reenactment of the fantasy every guy conjured up the moment they saw her, or at the very least an interpretation of it, her interpretation. The eyes, slanted, filtered, translated, they conformed to be seen rather than see, the eyes of a seductress. First she would turn her back on the boy, completely ignore him. Then she would quickly turn to him as if he had suddenly become the man inside his head, the man he needed to be. She would march right up to him as if she were tired of playing the game and straddle him like she wanted to just fuck the life right out of him. Dan looked over to see one of the other dancers pass behind his current occupation. He instantly recognized her. Though her garment was drastically different, it was the receptionist from the hospital. She spoke casually at first. "I told you we've seen each other before," she smiled. It was almost diabolical. She turned to Dan's dancer and smiled. The dancer smiled back. Between them were big wide eyes and bright smiles. Dan sensed a nightmare slowly becoming real. Were they in cahoots? It seemed that way. The young black receptionist whispered something in the ear of Dan's dancer, but he didn't wait for a reaction. He got to his feet in fear, in a panic, and left the area of dark booths. Back in the crowded hall of loud music and pulsing dancers, Dan searched. Jeremy was nowhere to be found. Dan felt frustrated that Jeremy had not become magically tuned to the needs of the situation and manifested himself. A large, bald man eclipsed the space that Dan shared with his ignorant population. "It's your friend," said the bouncer. "He's in the parking lot." Dan was right. This was a nightmare. For reasons he did not yet know, or may never know, this was indeed a bona fide nightmare. The bouncer began to lead Dan outside of the club, but before he did, Dan turned to see the bewildered stripper. He noticed them both, the stripper and the passerby, that receptionist from the old people's home where his father stayed at. Dan saw his stripper. He took in one last sight of her. She looked different as she spoke to the young black receptionist. She was different, naked in a different sort of way. She was just a girl. Dan felt spilled out as he exited the club via the bouncer, much in the way the previous frat had tumbled. But there were no others, only him, so it was less chaotic. He wondered for a moment if this was the manner in which all patrons were released. Jeremy sat on the sidewalk curb as Dan approached him in the wide parking lot. "Shit," said Jeremy. "I would have called a cab." Dan looked down at his friend. There was a psychotic gloss in the wide-eyed drunk, a joyous, open, clueless gaze in the young man's eyes as he looked up at Dan. Dan looked down at his friend in disgust. Jeremy was helpless. He was a mess waiting to be cleaned, and Dan did not feel that it was his duty to clean it any more than doing the dishes was his. He wanted to bark and snap Jeremy's head off, but he didn't. "What happened?" he asked instead. "I think I slapped her ass," replied Jeremy. "Whose?" "And they threw me out, just like that." Jeremy was not in the state to listen. He snapped his fingers when he spoke. "Just like that." It was clear to Dan now that his friend was a lot more intoxicated than he himself was. "I've been drinking all night long," Jeremy finally said. He was apparently not too drunk to miss the expression on Dan's face. Jeremy was apologetic. Dan wanted to strangle his friend, but he couldn't. He was trapped by his surroundings. "I've been drinking all night long," he finally said. "That's right," said Dan. He waited until the huff of the evening had passed. "All right, let's go," he said. And with that, Dan walked off. Jeremy got up and followed him, and they headed for the parked car. Surprisingly, Dan found himself not to be that upset. With that steadfast determination not to let the leaning tower bother him as it crumbled. And it did. He was going to keep right on keeping on. He knew it. There was no escaping it. He was headed home, and there was nothing he could do about it. Theresa was the inevitable in his life, always had been. If his life was a house of cards, it was going to blow, and it was going to blow over. The car took some time starting up and letting the heater kick in. The two of them sat there. Fuck, said Dan. Fucking A, added Jeremy, in an oblivious state. Why's that? Asked Dan, his curiosity fueled by the paved road of frustration. Just a slap on the ass, replied Jeremy. Look, but don't touch, he added as an afterthought. That's right, confirmed Dan. Why? It'd keep things safe. Yeah? Jeremy asked, his tone going up an optimistic octave. Safe, replied Dan, calmly to himself. He started the car into reverse and then he drove. Yeah, said Jeremy with half a heart. Who knows, he added. She might have fallen in love with me. We wouldn't want that to happen, now would we, said Dan, a stern reply, not accepting his friend's sense of humor. Fuck her, said Jeremy, exhausted. I doubt that very much. They were on the road now, and Dan drove. It was fear that began to creep up inside of him. It was the Maine road, the open highway, free and dark, his dim headlights extended only by what was long ago deemed a regulation. Well, said Jeremy, he was back to being happy-go-lucky, we'll never know. He continued in the consistent fashion. The long arm of commerce just had to intervene. That's because you slapped its ass, said Dan. A momentary lapse in reason, replied Jeremy. It's the anarchist in me, he continued. But the bottom line is, we're safe now. No, said Dan. She's safe now. Oh yeah, she's safe now, Jeremy trailed off. Well, whatever, he said under his breath. It was soon after that Dan looked over to see his old friend catching a little shut-eye. Once again, Dan's thoughts of escape returned to him. His father was nowhere in sight, but the idea of a jailbreak in that dust-mite-filled room still clouded the back of his brain like an unwanted joke. He had taken every detour he could think of, yet it still remained. Dan cursed his own lack of imagination as he took the last exit to Jeremy's house off the old city byway. Reality was a rock to be moved, and he had neither the strength nor the willpower to do so. It was beyond that rock, beyond his desire, that a night sky of tiny stars waited to be explored. Fuck, he said aloud. He dropped Jeremy off with the usual goodbyes, knowing full well that the night, his night, was young. The streets became paved in a different way. This was a voyage home. Dan felt the tips of long fingers tickle the back of his mind. Regret had a full hand. 9. It was a tall, dark house, the house where Theresa and Dan lived. It was very old. Farms and fields were its earliest neighbors. Dan's car slowly parked itself into the driveway like a piece in a two-part puzzle. How do I get inside, wondered Dan. It was late. He had that working for him. Dan entered the dark room, his bedroom, like a child breaking into his own home. He saw her body humped under the blankets. There was too much cover to see her breathe, but he knew she was still asleep. This was good. Yet Dan could not resist himself. He was a caricature next to her at that moment. He collapsed onto the bed and let his eyes quickly get fixated on the ceiling. He let out a deep sigh. She stirred. "Fuck," Dan said aloud by habit. He successfully tried not to exhale. "You smell like strippers," Theresa uttered from her sleepy, half-alarmed state. "I know," said Dan, pretending not to care. "Why?" she asked. "Why ask why?" humored Dan. "That's a stupid answer," replied Theresa. She was not humored. She still had not rolled over to face her lover. She would needle him until he said something intelligent or until she fell asleep again, whatever came first. "I don't feel like fighting," confessed Dan. "Neither do I," she said. All of Dan's relief felt succinct as it formed in that one basic and comfortable word. Good. His anxiety drained with release, and he let his guard down. "But I will," she added. It was the cherry on top that made her deceptively simple proclamation become a frightful and deliciously rich new flavor for Dan to hesitantly consume. She was a trooper. She was a worthy adversary. She had exhausted his will already with those 3 little words, and the fight hadn't even begun yet. The light came on. Theresa pulled that chain which hung from the lamp on the bedside table. It burned Dan's eyes. He had spent the previous moments navigating himself through the dark, out of his car and up the stairs. Theresa sat up. "Look at me," she said. "I can't," said Dan. Inside he was squirming. Fear and honesty ravished every muscle in his body. His eyes began to slowly focus in the light. He turned and looked at her, guarded. She was unimpressed. "Are you pissed at me because I went to the club?" he asked. He already knew the answer, but it never hurt to play dumb. "Yes," replied Theresa calmly, "but not really." This was a bad sign. It meant she had bigger fish to fry. "I also went and saw my dad today." "Don't change the topic," she said. Now was not the time to discuss that. Dan sighed, defeated. He returned his gaze to the ceiling. "How much money did you spend?" Theresa was covering all the basics. Logistics, like money, came first, then the nitty-gritty. Then she would break out her psychic knives to pierce him with. "None," said Dan. "Practically none." "You didn't get a lap dance?" Dan paused before he spoke. It got interrupted. Dan wondered if he should elaborate. He felt overwhelmed by the tactics his mind would conceive to end this argument quickly so he could get some much-needed sleep. The words just spilled out of him. "Jeremy got kicked out." "You went with Jeremy?" "Yeah." "Why?" "I guess he slapped some girl on the ass." "Figures." Theresa put her fingers up against Dan's temple and nudged his head. It was jarring to Dan. "Whenever you two get together, it never ends well." "I know. So why?" asked Theresa again. "I don't know," replied Dan. But this was only half true. It was obvious too much beer in Jeremy was reckless. But Dan did not know why he was compelled to invite that. "Why didn't you want to be with me tonight?" Theresa asked. "I did," said Dan. He felt an onslaught of hindsight. It was a difficult clarity to deal with at that moment, and he began to suppress it with a quiet rage. "You're avoiding me," said Theresa. "No, I'm not," replied Dan, frustrated. "Yes, you are. You always go to the strip clubs when you're avoiding me." "Not everything is about you," replied Dan. "Christ, Dan, you're so fucking predictable, it's not even funny." "All right, so I'm avoiding you." Dan agreed with her only because he thought it would hurt her more than to try and argue a futile discussion. It was a way that he could simultaneously both win and lose. Still? She asked. She seemed unfazed by it. No, not still, said Dan, with tight lips. You can be a real shit, you know that? You have to know that. I mean, there's no way anybody could be this fucking oblivious. And I'm a really cool chick. Dan said nothing. You're such a fucking amateur. What? Like what you said last night. What did I say last night? You don't remember? No, I don't. Everything you say, it's like one long and endless stream of bullshit. Is that it? What did I say? Talking all macho about this and that, and about how you're never going to get married and this and that. All I know is that it's late and I want to get some sleep. Well, I wanted to get some sleep too, after waiting for you for like hours. And then you come in here like a fucking asshole and flop down on the bed. I'm sorry about that, said Dan slowly. I'm sorry I woke you. Sorry I started this. Sorry you got caught. Yeah, sorry, said Dan sarcastically. I'm sure you are. There was something about Theresa's tone that was unusual. Are you saying I meant to wake you up? Did you? She asked. No, said Dan, but the question, like many of her other remarks that evening, had struck a mysterious chord with him. Like maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't sorry that he got caught. Maybe he wanted to get caught. Maybe he needed her disapproval and pain and anger and disappointment because that was how he felt he should be. If only he was capable. He felt cold. Really, she asked. Are you sure you didn't just want to rub it in? She sneered. You sadistic fuck. I did have a good time, said Dan, but Theresa did not hear him. Her mind was still rolling out the speech. You're a man. You can do whatever you want. I bet you still think that, like a fucking dinosaur. I saw my father today, said Dan, casually, still thinking he was being ignored. I don't care, snapped Theresa. He's crazy, said Dan. Yeah, I know, said Theresa. You say that every time you go and see him. I actually fucking listen to you, even though you don't listen to me. I guess what I'm trying to say, said Dan, is that it's late, and it's been a long day. Can we please just talk about this in the morning? No, said Theresa. She wanted to claw his heart out like a lion and spit into the wound. She was getting stronger. Dan feared that this pointless banter could last, like the tides, into the small hours of dawn. All right, he declared. What do you want me to say? Where are we going? Please, just tell me, he said. Is this about last night? He asked, with his mouth hanging open and his eyes wide open. Waiting for a reply, he had paused himself in obnoxious fashion. Yes, said Theresa. How? I want to talk about last night. Theresa had captured him. Theresa was in her mode now. You think I don't know you, but I do. Her words lay gentle on the air, like a snake in the grass. She was a viper, waiting to strike. All right, fine, confessed Dan. You want to get married? He continued, and then he stuttered. You thought we should get married. I didn't think it was such a great idea, and now you know why, Dan said. It was as if he said, There, I just proved it to you. That fear and the unknown honesty returning to him. Why? She asked. Dan released his own flood of obviousness. Because we're fighting, he declared. Oh, give me a break, Theresa shrugged it off. You're just being a pussy. Why? Asked Dan. Because I went to a strip club? You really think that can make you happy? Her question lingered in front of a hatchet that was waiting to come down on Dan. It was going to cut his balls off. It was going to cut his head off. Dan feared for the moment. No, said Dan. A heart beyond the tits, inquired Theresa. I don't know, continued Dan. Really, you really don't know, said Theresa. I can't fucking believe you're saying this to me. We've been together for 4 years now, and you know I had something very special planned for the evening. This was her taking the relationship seriously. Is it our anniversary? Asked Dan, stupid like a child. No, replied Theresa, not that. No? Then what? It was going to be a surprise. I actually wanted to make up with you. Stupid me. I actually wanted to ease your mind." She spoke like someone who knew. She spoke like she had already known that Dan had gone to see his father, had spoken with Oscar, had gone to the strip club, had met with Jeremy. "I find that very hard to believe," started Dan. "You wanted to spring it on me, like this, again and again and again." "And again and again and again," continued Theresa, "until you got it." She looked at him now. "Why?" "Because I love you, you fuck," said Theresa. "Don't ask me why," she continued. "And you think you're so smart. You always think you're so much smarter than me." "I don't think that," confessed Dan. "Yes, you do," said Theresa. "Why is it that something that happened last night, something that seemed like nothing more than pillow talk, was able to erupt a big argument just 24 hours later?" asked Dan. "Because I've had time to think," said Theresa. "Oh?" He understood Theresa in that moment, and how things needed to fester with her. 4 years, and it had taken this long. "And no, it's not because I'm stupid," she said. "I didn't say that you were," replied Dan. "I didn't even think that." And so their words flowed through one another like a dance of rivals. Continuously, Theresa would refer back to the conversation they had shared the other night, the conversation that really took place. What was happening now was just in the ether. Theresa spoke of everything she wanted to say but didn't. She conjured up those pregnant pauses and breathed new life into them. Dan sensed it. He saw it coming. Even as it was happening, he saw it coming. He felt like he had just been given a bastard child. The elderly couple that stood outside the flower shop, the couple that Theresa had seen, they were beginning to speak. They mumbled something to Dan in his mind. He could not understand them because they spoke the language of dreams. It was the language of dreams that would set you free, he thought he heard them say. Dan finally decided to confess the fuel he felt. Throughout this and the other, that is, the previous conversation, he felt the brewing of truth until finally it bubbled up and came out of his mouth like painful vomit. "I'd just like to hear you talk," he sighed with frustration. "What?" she asked. "At night, I'd just like to hear you talk." It felt good to say this out loud. "Sometimes I don't even know what you're saying or talking about." "So you're not listening?" asked Theresa. She hesitated to word the question just right. "Well, I am and I'm not," added Dan. "It's all about listening to the sound of your voice." "Jesus, Dan." Theresa felt that a cruel joke had just been played on her, but that now it was time to just relax. "It relaxes me," said Dan. "I know it does, but that's not even the point. It's like you don't even care." "Look," cried Dan, "can we just stop talking?" Dan had a good grip on her naked waist now. "Just for tonight," he promised. Dan leaned over and kissed her cheeks, then her lips. "To be continued," she said. She felt swept away by a sensation of solace. It was in these times that she could dream of a better man. "All right," he said. He returned his sense of humor to the mouth where it belonged. "And I promise, I'll try not to be swayed by the melody of your drowsy drawl." "All right," she said. "You just like to hear me talk." She turned to him and smiled. It was flattering. "In the early morning hours you sound like an old boat engine." It seemed as though they both enjoyed the sound of each other's voice. "What?" laughed Dan. "Put, put, put," continued Theresa, doing the sound of a boat's engine, only lower sounding, she continued. "Put, put, put," said Dan. He made a conscious effort this time, something to sound like a motor. "Yeah, that's it." "Well, start me up," said Dan, doing a half-hearted impersonation from the old Mick Jagger song. He rolled on top of her in an embrace and kissed her. She pushed him off, back on his back. Soon they were naked. She threw one leg over him under the sheets, and his growing cock brushed up against the warmth of her inner thigh. "Are we still fighting?" asked Dan. She looked down at him with a wide grin and a wet spark in her eyes. It was a still moment, and she owned it. Dan rolled on top of her, and she let him. Her body was mapped by his deliberate hands, palm to skin. The touch was superficial, but their eyes were deep and their mouths eager. They kissed passionately. Dan slid his hot member into her soaked web of muscles, tendons, and nerve endings, and they began to make love. As their bodies churned, something happened. It was green, and under the bed. Bang! It lifted the entire frame off the floor and dropped it. It was like something had struck their bed from below with such force that it might have been a rocket, or a sledgehammer, or an act of God. Both Dan and Theresa, startled with their eyes open, held each other in a moment of frozen fear and time. "What was that?" she asked slowly. They both knew something was wrong. Dan was the first to take action. As he ushered Theresa off of him, he leaned over the side of the bed and peeked. He saw nothing but darkness. "Something's down there," he said. "Was it an earthquake?" "No," said Dan. "Turn the lights on." Theresa did so. She got out of bed, naked, and walked to the window. "Nothing hit the house," she said. "It's under the bed," said Dan. "It came from under the bed." Theresa turned back to Dan at the bed, naked and afraid. She stood so far away from him when she saw it. Her body tingled with paralyzing hysteria. She wanted to piss herself, but she couldn't. "Dan," she said softly, with eyes wide open for something so terrible to just leap right into them, something terrible like the thing that was currently looking back at her. In all Dan's years of knowing her, she had never looked so vulnerable. "What is it?" Dan asked, inviting her to take sanctuary in his cautionary tone. The eyes under the bed, were two red glowing slits in the dark shadows. They watched Theresa as if she could not see them. Theresa raced for the bed between 2 seconds and jumped. The hairs on the back of her neck remained poised. She landed in a cushion of panic next to her man. She held him tightly. "There's something under the bed." "I know," said Dan. "That's what I've been saying." Theresa didn't answer, though. She was distracted. She had seen it. "What is it?" asked Theresa. Her uncertainty disgusted her. Dan could not soothe her disgust. "I checked. I couldn't see anything," he said. His logic became a butterfly with wings, and it left him for the sky. "It was probably a squirrel or something," he said, trying to reel in some unknown kite that had just stolen everything they had ever known. It was futile, and it soon spoke. "No, I am not a squirrel," said the voice. It filled the room in its apparent absence, like a performer taking the spotlight for the first time. It was a slow and dark voice. It was the kind of voice that would crawl up your spine with its spider legs and suck the black tingle right out of your veins. It was raspy and it was real like a nightmare. Theresa erupted with a startled yelp before Dan could silence her with his finger on her lips. But Dan was scared too. For a split second he wondered if he'd climaxed from his remembered erection into Theresa's lap, but quickly he realized he hadn't. He looked down, and he now saw his own dick, placid. "What do you want?" asked Dan, his stare fixed on nothing. Boldly he embraced his girlfriend. "Who are you?" There was no response until Theresa spoke. She whispered into his ear, revealing her state of mind. "There's something under the bed." When she stated the obvious, Dan felt the stones of stress pile on his mind and heart like some kind of medieval torture. He wanted to fuck away the whole night, the whole situation. "Yes, I know," he snapped. He spoke once again to the presence in the room. "What do you want?" he asked again. "You know what I want," replied the voice. It spoke simply, and there was nothing more horrific than this. For neither Dan nor Theresa knew what the voice wanted. The voice spoke with an understanding that the two naked souls that huddled together on that mattress could not comprehend between them, the weight of its own existence. "No, I don't," replied Dan adamantly. His voice curdled with courage, as if it had passed its expiration date. It now sounded weak and desperate. "Just take what you want and leave," cried Theresa. Her efforts were no more released. She practically squealed her demands. Dan pretended to lean over it and check under the bed once more, but he did not really see this time. He only meant to give Theresa the impression that he was, in fact, investigating the situation and was, in fact, ready to fight. "You know what I want," replied the voice. "Uh-huh," responded Dan sarcastically. He reached over to Theresa to get her attention. He inadvertently grabbed her breasts, and she looked at him as he returned her gaze to her. He pointed to the phone that lay on the bedside table. Dan removed his hand from her breast, and Theresa exhaled a quiet gasp of words into his face. She was desperately trying to speak with him. "He has red eyes," she said. The way she whispered reminded Dan of old fairy tales he used to hear as a kid about sirens on the rocks. They would wreck ships by drawing them too close to the shore. Theresa had not escaped the obvious shock of the situation, and her disbelief was raw. Jack Friedman aimed his pistol out the window. He sat in the passenger seat with his feet resting on the steering wheel. He squinted narrowly, finding his vantage beyond his extended hand. It was a Smith & Wesson .40 caliber, black. He held it at the woods on the far side of the road. It was dark out that night. The yellow moon had a mist of foggy fingers in front of it, playing a little game of Guess Who. Any discerning details of the trees were in a vacuum of shadows, and the sky was a moaning blue. But Jack saw it move once more. He continued to aim, casual but focused. "Someday I'm gonna kill you," he said out loud, barely thinking. It was as if the distant doe had heard him. It peeked its head up and took off, dashing away deeper into the forest, a crackle and a wisp as twigs and leaves parted. That was a fleeting nature which in some small part of Jack's heart he knew and understood. He sat up and holstered his weapon. He lit a cigarette and picked up his book to continue reading. Sheriff Jack Friedman never slept alone, so Sheriff Jack Friedman never slept. He had long become accustomed to manning speed traps at all hours of the evening. The book he read was on Beowulf, not the story itself, only the implications and metaphors therein. Jack was a well-read man, and he had eyes that would search a face as if he were reading a page, looking for that one key word. It was his desire to be a detective, but in these parts there wasn't much need for any real detecting. And Jack would never leave home. The town was too much a part of him. He was fused to it for good. It held his youth, his future, and his now. Jack thought of his youth. His mind wandered. Projecting at his frontal lobe were stark, blurry images at first. The Kodachrome of a man's soul. He saw a younger version of himself, as others might have seen it. A red cap, a wool jacket. The year was 1970. He wondered if he ever fully recovered himself from that, or whether there were still parts of him unknown, still roaming around in the forest like ghosts twisting in the breeze. The coffee thermos was Jack's job to hold and make sure that it didn't spill as the old dirt-red pickup wound its way around the mountainous road. Jack remembered his name making him feel old like an heirloom. He didn't know any other kids his age named Jack. The name conjured up older men like his father. So there he was, an old man, in a young man's clothes. Jack idolized that thermos, seeing how it was something that his father had brought to work every day since as long as Jack could remember. His father didn't speak. The only thing that could be heard was the engine of the working truck and the low, steady twang of the country music station that played on the radio. Jack was 12 and a half, almost 13. He looked over at his father, watched the cigarette dangle from the old man's lips, and watched as the old man drove his truck with the ease and concentration of experience. Even when the dirt road got tricky and Jack himself felt the pull of inertia in one way or another, the old man never let his foot off the gas pedal. "Yup," said Jack's father finally. He spoke as if they had been talking this whole time, and he was only just barely paying attention. The young Jack listened intently. "You're old enough now." "I am?" asked Jack. "Yup." "For what?" "When we get up to Tucker's Point, you head north up to the little creek, and I'll drive them your way." The old man never let his eyes leave the road. "This would have come earlier, but I guess the time comes when the time comes." Jack sensed that his father might be speaking to him in a manner that had never before been addressed. It frightened him a little. The old man spoke to a Jack who wasn't there. Inside, Jack was hiding. He felt his nerves awakened, and his skin hugged him under the thick, heavy coat he wore. But it was a useless hug now. It was his mother's hug. He was no longer with her. He was a man on the outside when his father spoke to him the way he did. The time had come, and he was not safe anywhere. He was inside of himself, and the walls were closing in. He wanted to punch out the window of that old beat-up red truck, but that didn't happen. The truck came to a rest at their destination, where the pipeline met the old logging roads, and where, before that, Indians used to walk the land like deer with weapons. They both got out of the truck in routine. The doors slammed like traps that had been escaped by things beyond them. Metallic hinges and locks would shut, and there would be nobody inside of them. It was all echoes now. Above them the sky was open, and it harbored the chirps of birds, a quiet freedom, and nature. The old man went to the bed of the truck. He retrieved a couple of rifles. He held one in each hand. "The first thing you need to understand," he said to his boy, "is that this is not a weapon. It is a tool." He handed the smaller one to Jack. It was an old Winchester 30-30, model 94. Jack took it and proportioned his body in such a way to make him feel young again. He was no longer Jack, a name of no other boys. He was just as small as the rifle that rested unnaturally across his arms. Jack was small for his age. Guns were something that he would grow into. At this point, neither Jack nor his father knew that the boy would be gone for 3 days. Neither of them knew that Jack's disappearance would eventually end up making all the papers, and even the local televised news. Jack would soon learn that they had organized a search party for him. 50 or so of his closest neighbors and friends would look for him. No one would ever really know what happened to Jack out there in the wilderness, even after they had found him and nourished him back to health and spoiled him. He was sight unseen. Jack thought back. Holy shit, did he think back. He thought about nature and the sunshine, and he thought about that mammoth beast he tried to kill. What was it? It was nothing. It never happened. In long lives, such as Jack's, fleeting moments didn't count. They were just there, like a dream. Nature was constant. It was strong enough to ignore all the abnormalities one might encounter. The sun would always shine, and the birds would always be chirping, and the breeze would always be there to swiftly cool you. Jack let his train of thought continue. His father spoke to him. The two of them stood there, beside the dirt road on that gravel flat top. "All right," said the old man. "Did you listen to everything I said?" he asked. "Yes," came Jack's dutiful reply. He felt innocent and fragile. He wanted to feel brave and anxious, and did his best to do so. "You head north, and you wait. You wait for it to come." The old man took a swig from his old thermos. "And it'll come running, believe me. It'll come fast at the sound of my gunfire." "What do I do then?" asked Jack, without thinking. Later he would curse such weak small talk, but at that time it was all he could muster. The old man looked at his son in such a way that it would forever be burned into the sight of Jack's brain. It was clear as day as Jack now thought of it. "You kill it," said the old man. The old man stopped himself from being bothered by his son. He let the surge of frustration pass with the understanding that soon Jack would be a man. It would be then that he might better understand the boy. There was something in the air that day. The old man couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it clouded his judgment with uncertainty. "You aim right this time," he continued, "just like I taught you." "Yeah," replied Jack. His voice escaped from him like a mouse from the mousetrap. "And don't worry," said the old man, slightly annoyed. "You'll do fine," he added sincerely. He put his arm around the boy as they headed up the road. Jack's father was a rugged shepherd, and Jack felt like a weak lamb. "You're not worthless," said the old man. The statement made Jack think, and it put his mind in a scary place. He wanted to throw up. The old man ushered Jack into the lips of the forest with his guiding hand. Finally he stopped and looked down at the boy. "Well," he said, "get up there and don't come down until you know." "Know what?" asked Jack. "Know what you're worth," smiled the old man. It was a loving moment between the two of them, and Jack began to slowly understand their bond. Jack felt like a growing branch that would one day take off and fly like magic. The old man pointed Jack's direction. "Just remember to keep the safety on when you're hiking those hills." He pointed to a sharp tree-studded incline that rested heavy rocks and boulders and was blanketed by pine needles. Jack left his father and didn't look back. He felt possessed by the words in his head. Walk away. His young conscious mind could contemplate the sounds of the words and let them echo and crackle like the errant flames from a midnight fire. Thus began the hike. Thus began the journey. Thus began the 3 days of Jack's isolation, the adventure that would cause quite a stir in the small town and even touch the news of statewide stations. It was the time young Jack got lost. Jack's ankles began to hurt inside of his loose-fitting boots as he hiked and hoofed his way up the steep inclines. He began to sweat in his wool coat, and his breath came short as his face turned red. He was never an athletic boy. He stepped on small rocks as he climbed. He lost his footing. slowly at first, and then his body quickly swayed and slid abruptly down several feet until his back landed up against an old fallen tree. The fall did not hurt him at all, and Jack was proud of this. He tried to get back to his feet, but it was not easy, and his rifle became cumbersome. It was then that he looked up into the noonday sun and saw it. The silhouette was still clear in his mind. It had the head of a 12-point buck and the body of a man. Its muscles were real. It stood above him only briefly. Jack blinked, and it was gone. He fumbled for his gun, but the safety was still on, and it was of no use to him unless he could track down what he had just seen. He was afraid and excited, but there was no one else around to talk to. He quickly got to his feet and raced back up the hill as fast as he could. Jack would look for the beast those 3 days he was missing, but he would never find it. He wandered until he nearly died from exhaustion. It was the sheriff that eventually found him, an older man by the name of Lee Cook. Jack tried to explain to his rescuer what he had seen. "Well," said the sheriff after he had heard the whole story, "it isn't that I don't believe you, son," he said. "I just think you're better off keeping this to yourself." And that was that. Jack never told another soul what he had seen that day, not even his father. The call came through from radio dispatch like an interruption. It nearly startled Jack out of his seat. It was the static voice of Sheila that broke Jack's calm state of isolation. He was no longer alone. There was someone talking to him, someone trying to reach out to him, and her disembodied voice cut through the air like a sharp knife. "Jack," she said. "You awake?" she asked. Jack picked up the CB and answered her. "Always," was his reply. "Yeah, well, I thought you'd say something like that." "What is it?" he asked. "It's a 415 over at Pittsfield Lane," came her reply. 415, breaking and entering, thought Jack. "I bet you a nickel you can't get there before the trooper," continued Sheila with a charm in her voice. "Honey, you know how fast I drive," Jack said. Sheila swooned. "Oh, you're so fast," she said. "Get your nickels ready. I'm on my way." Jack had long since honed his skills for covering up the fact that he was nearly always preoccupied, and at the end of the day, he liked to play along with the usual mock rivalry the sheriff's department had with the Buxton PD. It was status quo, and there was something Jack really valued about that. Jack put the last gear in throttle and released the brake. The result was a smoky eruption, and then a haze of rubber vapor, and the car was off with a screech. Jack wanted to scare every animal in the forest with that car. He loved to drive fast, and when the young kids of town wanted to drag race up past Old Farm Road, Jack would get a thrill out of nailing them, and despite his authoritative tone, he would secretly admire their youthful freedom. It was much like the way a lion would admire the graceful stride of a fleeing gazelle on those nature programs Jack would watch after his shift had ended. "Take the 4th left at Pittsfield," said Sheila over the radio. "It's 22 Farrell Drive." Jack passed the night trees which loomed alongside the road like dark waiting giants. They were anonymous witnesses to all of the drunk drivers Jack and his associates had to peel from auto wreckage over the years. Jack thought briefly about the many dead he had seen in his career as sheriff, some men, some women, some children, and he kept driving. 11. "Who did you just call?" asked the voice out of the silence that reigned in Dan and Theresa's bedroom. It was still a dark voice and very unsettling. It menaced Dan and Theresa, and they regretted hearing it speak. "The police," replied Dan. "You're busted." Dan spoke with a mouthful of spite. He didn't know who or what he was addressing. All he knew is that he didn't like it. "Oh?" said the voice, though it did not seem very concerned. "What do you want?" pleaded Theresa once more. "I want," said the voice slowly, "the kid." Dan immediately turned to Theresa, who was clinging to his side. She shook her head no. No, she didn't understand what the voice was asking for either. "What kid?" asked Dan. The voice said nothing. "We don't have any kids." "You've got the wrong house," said Theresa. "No, I don't think I do," replied the voice with a hint of amusement. "In fact, I think I am exactly where I need to be." This time the voice couldn't help but release a subtle snicker under its heavy breath. Theresa wanted to wake from this dream. She wanted to cry. She had seen the eyes, and they were real. They were ugly. They had looked right at her, through her. "We don't have any kids," shouted Dan. He wondered if he could get a hold of this voice the same way it had gotten a hold of him and Theresa. He wondered if he could frighten it or intimidate it. The sinking feeling that this was not possible quickly became apparent. The voice replied smoothly, calmly, and darkly as it did before. "I want the kid," it said. Jack pulled up to the Livingston household, and most of the lights were off. Things seemed quiet. He got out of his patrol car and radioed in to Sheila. 10-4, I'm at the residence now." Jack walked across the green lawn and up to the front door. He knocked 3 times. Dan turned to Theresa. "They're here." Theresa hugged him tighter. "You hear that, you weird son of a bitch? They're here." But the voice said nothing. Jack knocked once more. "Sheriff's Department," he announced as loud as he could. "Open up," he called out once more. He heard a distant voice from inside. It sounded like a man. Jack tried the door. It was unlocked. He knocked once more as he entered the house. "Sheriff's Department." "Up here," Dan's voice carried throughout the house, seeking ears in every nook and cranny. Jack walked slowly. He examined everything he saw, the empty kitchen, the empty living room, the empty dining room. Nothing seemed disturbed. He slowly made his way up the stairs. "Sheriff's Department," said Jack once more. It was a tense round of Marco Polo taking place. "In here," Dan called out from the bedroom. Jack checked the bathroom. He checked the guest room. Still nothing. He finally decided to enter the bedroom, from where it was now apparent the police were coming. Jack entered to find Dan and Theresa huddled together. Theresa still looked frightened. Dan looked a little relieved. The sight of the two of them, naked, in such a state of shock, disarmed Jack a little, and he asked from his instinct rather than the usual professional protocol. "What is it?" asked Jack. The words came out of him like they were released from prison. He spoke no longer with the words like mice from a mousetrap. That was a long time ago. "Under the bed," said Dan, deadpan. Jack slowly bent over and with a flashlight in hand illuminated the floor beneath the bed. Nothing. Jack looked up at Dan and Theresa. "What is this?" he asked. "Is there someone else here? In this room?" "Yes," said Theresa. "Who?" "We don't know," said Dan. "That's why we called you." Jack checked once more under the bed. Still nothing. "Under the bed?" he asked. "Yes," replied Dan. "He was here just a minute ago," continued Theresa. Her eyes were wide and innocent, and she spoke only to fill the pregnant pause that Jack had attained. He walked slowly to the closet. "Hello?" Jack called out. "Is there someone else in here?" Jack found himself to be utterly baffled by the entire situation. It was surreal. "This is the Sheriff's Department, and if there is someone else in this room right now, show yourself." Jack opened the closet door. Nothing. He looked back at the couple in bed, and their expressions offered nothing more but fear and shock and uncertainty and confusion and nothingness. Something had happened. Something had happened in this room, but whatever it was, it did not appear to still be there. "You said there was an intruder?" he asked. "Yes, we were just talking to him a minute ago," said Dan. "Uh-huh," replied Jack with an air of skepticism. "Him?" "It was a male voice," said Theresa. "But you didn't see anything?" asked Jack. Theresa looked at Dan before he spoke. "No, like I said, he was under the bed," Dan said. The weight of the monster's absence began to smother Theresa's brain, which kicked and clawed at a world that had suddenly become irrational. "Have you kids been doing any drugs tonight?" asked Jack. It was a routine question, which was often followed by a kiss-off. "No," declared Dan sternly. Jack shined his flashlight in Dan's eyes, and Dan squinted and covered them. Without really testing him, Jack believed Dan was telling the truth. "Well," he offered, "is there a TV on in another room, or—" "We'd know if we were talking to a TV," cried Theresa. Tears streamed down her face now like a leaky soul that knew only fear and nakedness. "I saw it," she said. "It?" asked Jack. "Him," corrected Dan. "I saw him," said Theresa. "Only his eyes." "Just the eyes?" "They glowed under the bed." Theresa knew she had said too much, but she could not help herself. Desperation had gotten hold of her better judgment. The truth now was nothing more than a sick joke someone was playing on them, but they didn't know who. "They glowed?" asked Jack. "Yes," replied Dan quietly, willing to stand by Theresa's testimony, even though he didn't know or believe her entirely. There had to be a better explanation than this. All he knew for certain was that someone was there, and now they weren't. Jack looked at Theresa. "You mean like this?" He shined the flashlight in her face. She withdrew and coiled from the bright light in her eyes. "No," she cried. "I mean like a pair of two glowing eyes." Her voice was shaken. She felt lost, like a child in a great big forest. Dan recognized the tone of her voice immediately. He checked under the bed once more, quickly this time as if to catch the spook off guard. There was still nothing there. Jack got to his feet. "All right," he finally said. He carried with him a solid authority as he looked directly at Dan. "You," he said. "We need to talk." "All right," said Dan. He tried not to sound too timid. He gently put Theresa to one side as he slid out of bed. He stood there on the cold hardwood floors, naked. "You can put your clothes on," said Jack, and he left the room, not waiting for Dan to frantically grab a pair of jeans off the floor. Dan quickly put his legs through, one at a time, and then zipped up carefully so not to catch his groin or pubic hair in the interlocking teeth. "Dan," said Theresa, "don't leave me," she pleaded. Dan couldn't look at her. He felt like an ass, and he needed to recover himself. "Dan," she continued once more. Dan followed the path of Jack out into the hallway and down the stairs, through the downstairs hallway, and into the living room. Jack put a hand on Dan's shoulder and looked at him deep in the eyes. "I need to know what's going on here," said Jack. "Honestly." "Honestly?" asked Dan. "Yes." "I don't know," said Dan, defeated. Jack looked over the young man before him, head to toe. He was sizing Dan up. This did not seem like the usual prank call. Not that Jack got many of those. It was usually around Halloween when a few of them would roll around. Jack would kick it over to one of the rookies at the Buxton PD. "I need you to be straight with me," Jack stressed his words. "No more monkey business." Dan would have smirked if the circumstances were different. "No more monkey business," Dan said. "What's really going on here? Is there any kind of mental issue?" "No," said Dan. "Nobody here is insane." Jack thought for a moment. He hesitated to ask. "Is this a sex thing?" "What?" Dan was dumbfounded. "Are you exhibitionist?" "No." Dan was insulted. "Is this any kind of... are you... We're not exhibitionists,"
This isn't my fucking kink. You didn't even put clothes on before I got here. We couldn't. There was something there, under the bed. Well, there isn't anymore. Where does that leave us? You're either crazy or... I'm not crazy. We're not crazy. And this isn't a fucking sex thing. I don't know what this is. Between the two of them, it was a standoff. They were caught together in a tornado of frustration and ignorance towards the situation.